In the shadow-draped corners of a sprawling metropolis, the Hathaway building stood as a grim reminder of the city's less savory history. A towering structure of faded brick and stained windows, it had been many years since Hathaway had seen better days. Now, it served as low-cost housing for those desperate enough to ignore its ominous reputation. Alice, a young college graduate with aspirations of becoming a journalist, was drawn to Hathaway by the allure of cheap rent and the promise of a good story. She moved into apartment 513, a modest one-bedroom unit with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but what truly interested her were the stories that seemed embedded in the very walls of the building. From the moment she moved in, Alice felt a chill that never seemed to go away, a constant cold draft that whispered of hidden secrets. Her neighbors were an eclectic mix: old Mrs. Delaney, who had lived in the building since the 1960s, Tom the gruff handyman who knew every inch of the building, and young Mia, a quiet girl who always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. Alice began to document her experiences from day one, her blog entries a mix of personal reflections and interviews with her neighbors. She learned about the Hathaway's sordid past, the site of a tragic fire in the 1920s, a series of unexplained disappearances in the 50s, and countless reports of strange occurrences that had never been satisfactorily explained. But it was the basement that held the darkest stories. Long sealed off from the main floors, it was rumored to be the heart of the building's haunting. Intrigued and undeterred, Alice convinced Tom to let her explore it, promising to mention him in her blog if he would accompany her. The descent into the basement was like stepping into another world. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. Old files, furniture, and forgotten relics of past tenants were piled high, casting long shadows in the dim light of their flashlights. As they moved deeper, Tom's usually unflappable demeanor began to falter. He muttered about feeling watched and pointed out areas of the basement where even he refused to go. Suddenly, Mia's voice echoed through the building's old intercom system, frantic and clipped with static. "Alice, come back up now." "Something's happening." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, humming noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Tom, pale and shaken, urged a hasty retreat, but Alice's curiosity had been piqued. Ignoring Tom's protests, she ventured toward a secluded corner of the basement where the hum was loudest. There, hidden beneath a dusty tarp, she discovered an old radio, its lights flickering as though it was struggling to stay on. As she reached out to touch it, the air around her crackled with electricity, and the building shook as if gripped by an unseen force. The walls around them began to groan, and the shadows seemed to swirl and coalesce into the form of a man, his features blurred but his presence unmistakable. Tom grabbed Alice's arm, pulling her away as the radio erupted into a cacophony of voices, screams, pleads for help, and a deep, malevolent laugh that chilled her to the bone. They ran for the stairs, the building seeming to convulse around them, each step upward a battle against an unseen malice that didn't want them to leave. They emerged into the hallway, breathless and terrified. Mia was waiting, her eyes wide with fear. She told them that the building had locked down, every exit sealed and the windows impossible to open. The residents had gathered in the lobby, trapped and terrified, as the haunting that had plagued Hathaway for decades seemed to come to a horrific crescendo. Determined to uncover the truth and hopefully end the nightmare, Alice, Tom, and Mia decided to delve into the building's history, searching for any clue that might tell them why the Hathaway was so haunted and how they might cleanse it of its malevolent presence. Their search led them to old newspaper clippings, interviews with past residents, and a series of letters hidden in the walls during renovations, each piece of the puzzle hinting at a sinister web of rituals, secret societies, and a cursed object said to be buried within the building's foundations. As the night wore on, the disturbances grew more violent and bizarre. Objects flew through the air, spectral figures appeared and vanished at will, and the cries of the damned echoed through the halls. The residents, driven to the brink by fear, looked to Alice and her friends to save them from the encroaching darkness. Just as Alice uncovered a potential link between the haunted radio and the disturbances, a new horror emerged from the basement. The radio had been a beacon, and now something had answered its call. The ground shook, and from the bowels of the earth, a new, more terrifying force began to make itself known. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath turned to mist, and a deep, pervasive dread settled over everyone trapped inside. As Alice, Tom, and Mia regrouped with the others in the lobby, they found the residents huddled together, some praying, others simply rocking in silent terror. The building's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was filled with the scent of ozone, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a sinister life force. Alice knew they had to act quickly. She pulled Tom and Mia aside, sharing her discovery of the connection between the old radio and the haunting. The device appeared to be an antique known as a spirit box, used in the early 20th century for seances. It seemed that during one such session, something had been invited and that had never left. Determined to find the cursed object believed to be buried within the building's foundation, which might be amplifying the building's paranormal activity, they devised a plan. They would split up, with Tom and some of the braver residents searching the old records for any blueprint that might show hidden areas or renovations, while Alice and Mia would try to communicate with the spirits using the spirit box, hoping to pacify them or at least understand what they wanted. As Tom left with his group, Alice and Mia set up in the center of the lobby. Alice turned on the spirit box, adjusting the frequency as static filled the air. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of white noise, but then, voices began to emerge. They were disjointed, filled with pain and anger, speaking over each other in desperate tones. "We are trapped. Free us. He brought us here." The messages were chilling, and Mia clutched Alice's arm, her face pale. As the voices grew louder, the building shook violently, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The lobby windows shattered, sending glass flying like deadly rain, and the doors warped and twisted, sealing them in even tighter. Back in the basement, Tom's group made a horrifying discovery. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a small, sealed chamber. Inside, amid a collection of bizarre occult artifacts, was an old, leather-bound book and a blackened dagger. The book contained detailed drawings and incantations, and at its center, a disturbing illustration that matched the layout of the Hathaway building, a pentagram, with each point marked by a room in the building. Realizing the significance of their find, Tom grabbed the book and dagger and rushed back to the lobby, hoping that whatever answers the book held could help them end the nightmare. As he ran, the halls of Hathaway seemed to warp around him, the walls stretching and floors buckling as if the building itself was trying to prevent him from reaching his destination. When Tom arrived back at the lobby, out of breath and clutching the book, Alice quickly skimmed through it, her eyes widening with each page turn. The book confirmed that the Hathaway building was constructed as a kind of supernatural prison, designed to contain a powerful entity that had been summoned and then could not be controlled. The pentagram design was a containment symbol, meant to keep the entity locked away. The book also contained a ritual that, if performed correctly, might banish the entity back to wherever it had come from. However, the ritual required the dagger, and it needed to be performed at the heart of the building, the basement from which the disturbances seemed to emanate. As they prepared to head to the basement, the building's disturbances reached a fever pitch. The air turned icy, and spectral figures appeared more solidly, their faces twisted in expressions of rage and sorrow. They seemed to be both drawn to and repelled by the spirit box, which continued to crackle and spit static. Alice, Tom, Mia, and a few others made their way to the basement, the air growing colder with each step down. As they reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them. The only light came from their flashlights, which flickered intermittently as if struggling against an unseen force. In the center of the basement, right where the old radio had been found, they set up for the ritual. Tom placed the dagger on the ground, while Alice read from the book. The words were in a language she didn't understand, ancient and guttural, but as she spoke them aloud, the air around them began to thrum with power. The shadows in the corners of the basement grew denser, coalescing into a dark, swirling vortex. The voices from the spirit box grew louder, a cacophony of screams and pleadings that made it hard to focus. But Alice continued, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. As she reached the climax of the ritual, a brilliant light exploded from the dagger, enveloping the room in a blinding flash. For a moment, everything was still, the screams and the rumbling ceasing abruptly. The group shielded their eyes, and when the light dimmed, they found themselves standing in a silence so profound it was almost palpable. However, the relief was short-lived. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they noticed that the symbols etched into the floor of the basement began to glow ominously, a deep red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of impending doom. The ritual, it seemed, had not banished the entity but had instead awakened it fully. From the center of the glowing pentagram, a crack appeared in the floor, widening and deepening rapidly. A foul smell, like that of decay and sulfur, emanated from the chasm, and a low growl reverberated from within, shaking the very foundations of the Hathaway building. Alice stepped back, her heart pounding as she clutched the ritual book to her chest. The pages had begun to turn on their own, flipping back to a passage that had been overlooked. The ritual was not meant to banish but to bind, and it required a sacrifice to complete. Panic swept through her as she realized the implications. The growl intensified, a sound so terrifying it seemed to claw at their very souls. Tom, grasping the severity of their situation, shouted over the noise, urging everyone to think of a way to seal the crack without a sacrifice. Mia, her eyes wide with fear, suggested they try to reverse the ritual, to perhaps push the entity back enough to seal the pentagram and contain it once again. The group scrambled, searching the book for any clue on how to reverse the process. The building trembled violently, cracks spreading up the walls, dust and debris falling around them. The figures that had haunted the hallways appeared again, this time more defined, their expressions tormented as they seemed to plead with the living to correct the mistake. Working together, Alice and Mia recited the incantations backwards, a desperate attempt to undo what had been done. Tom and a few others began to push heavy objects over the crack, trying to physically block the entity from emerging further. The air was filled with a cacophony of noises, the growls from the depths, the chanting of the ritual, the screams of the spectral figures, and the structural groans of the Hathaway building itself. As the ritual reversed, the red light from the pentagram began to fade, dimming to a dull glow. The crack in the floor started to close slowly, the growls turning into roars of frustration as the entity fought against the containment. Alice's voice wavered, but strengthened by the sight of the closing gap, she pushed on, the ancient words of the ritual flowing faster from her lips. Just as the crack sealed shut, the pentagram exploded in a final burst of light, knocking everyone to the ground. Silence fell once again, heavy and ominous. As they stood, shaken but alive, they realized the immediate danger was over, but the Hathaway building would never be the same. Exhausted and traumatized, the group made their way back to the lobby. The other residents, who had felt the building shake to its core, greeted them with a mixture of relief and awe. Alice, Tom, and Mia shared a look of weary camaraderie, knowing they had barely escaped with their lives and had only managed a temporary solution. The entity was contained, but for how long? And at what cost? The building was significantly damaged, and the psychological scars borne by its inhabitants would take even longer to heal. Moreover, the spirit box continued to crackle softly, a chilling reminder that the connection to the otherworldly had been opened and might never be fully closed. In the days that followed, as they began the process of repair and recovery, Alice continued to document everything. Her blog became a crucial recount of the events, drawing attention from paranormal experts, thrill seekers, and skeptics alike. But amidst the newfound fame, Alice couldn't shake off the dread of the basement's sealed crack and the glowing pentagram. The Hathaway building stood quieter now, its hauntings less frequent but more poignant. The residents spoke in hushed tones, their eyes often drawn to the basement door, which had been firmly locked and barred. But the peace was tenuous, the silence a thin veneer over the lingering terror that seeped through the cracks of the aging brickwork. Alice knew she could not leave the story unfinished, her responsibility to the building and its spectral inhabitants weighing heavily on her. The mystery of the Hathaway building was far from solved, and the horror that lay beneath was merely biding its time, waiting for a chance to rise again. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, the whisper of the entity's rage echoed in the wind, a promise of darkness yet to come. The air in the Hathaway building had changed, it was thicker, heavier with the echo of the recent horrors. Residents moved cautiously, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to stir the fragile peace that had settled over the complex. Alice felt the weight of their gazes, their unspoken expectations that she, somehow, held the key to their safety. Each step she took through the halls was shadowed by the memories of that night, the sounds and fears etched permanently into her mind. Days turned into weeks, and the building's eerie calm remained unbroken. However, Alice knew better than to trust this apparent tranquility. The entity, though contained, had left its mark. The basement door, heavy with new locks and warnings, stood as a grim reminder of the potential danger lurking just beneath their feet. Occasionally, she would pause by it, listening, half expecting to hear the growl of the entity or the whispers of the damned. Her blog had attracted a variety of attention. Paranormal investigators, curious skeptics, and even a documentary crew had come, each eager to uncover the truth of the Hathaway's haunted reputation. Alice cooperated where she could, sharing her experiences and the evidence collected, but she remained guarded, protective of the residents and the building's fragile peace. One evening, as autumn crept over the city, bringing with it a chill that seeped through even the thickest walls, a new development occurred. Alice received a mysterious package. It contained an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The note attached was cryptic, only stating, "Understand the past to protect the future." Curiosity piqued, Alice spent the night poring over the journal. It belonged to a previous caretaker of the building from the early 1900s, one who had witnessed the original binding ritual that contained the entity. The entries detailed not just the ritual but a prophecy of sorts, one that spoke of the cycle of the blood moon, a time when the entity's power would peak, capable of breaking its bonds if not resealed. The realization hit Alice like a cold wave. The next blood moon was due in just a few weeks. If the journal was correct, they had little time to prepare for whatever horrors awaited them. She shared her findings with Tom and Mia, and together they decided to delve deeper into the history and lore of the building, hoping to find a way to strengthen the containment spell. Their research led them to the city archives, where they uncovered old blueprints of the building and news clippings about its construction. The Hathaway had been built over the site of an ancient cemetery, and the foundation stones were rumored to have been taken from a dismantled church, notorious for its own dark history. Each piece of information added layers to the story, painting a picture of a building almost destined for darkness. Armed with new knowledge and growing trepidation, Alice, Tom, and Mia began to prepare for the coming blood moon. They enlisted the help of the other residents, forming a makeshift community of guardians. Together, they started to reinforce the physical and mystical defenses of the building, setting up salt lines, protective symbols, and even installing new security measures. As the night of the blood moon approached, the air grew tense with anticipation. The residents gathered in the lobby, some holding candles, others clutching talismans and holy symbols. Alice led them in setting up a ritual circle, using the old caretaker's journal as a guide. They placed the blackened dagger at the center, its blade reflecting the moonlight that filtered through the windows. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and as it did, the temperature dropped sharply. A low rumble echoed through the building, subtle at first but growing louder, more insistent. The walls began to vibrate, and a faint glow emanated from the basement door. It was beginning. Alice started the ritual, reciting the incantations from the journal. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled, knowing the gravity of what they faced. Tom and Mia stood by her side, chanting along, reinforcing the spell with their combined will. Outside, the sky turned a deep, bloody red, casting an ominous glow over the city. Inside, the glow from the basement grew brighter, and the rumbling turned into a roar. The building shook, plaster falling from the ceiling, windows rattling in their frames. The residents clung to each other, fear etching their faces as they watched the ritual unfold. Just as the clock struck midnight, a piercing scream erupted from the basement, a sound so terrifying it threatened to shatter their resolve. The floor beneath them cracked, a brilliant light shooting up from the fissure, enveloping the room in blinding radiance. When the light finally dimmed, they found themselves still standing, the building intact but the air charged with a power they could almost taste. The basement door remained closed, its locks glowing faintly with residual magic, as if sealing in the potent energies that had just been unleashed. The residents, shaken but unharmed, looked around in disbelief, their eyes wide with the realization that they had just skirted the edge of a dark abyss. Alice, breathing heavily from the effort of the ritual, felt the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. It had become warm, almost hot, its pages fluttering as if caught in a non-existent breeze. The words on the pages seemed to shimmer, revealing new lines that she had not noticed before, further instructions or perhaps warnings, obscured until this moment of need. The immediate threat had been abated, but the atmosphere in Hathaway Building remained charged, a lingering sense of something unfinished, something paused rather than ended. The residents slowly disbanded, returning to their apartments with weary steps and backward glances, their trust in the normalcy of their home irreparably shaken. In the days that followed, a heavy fog settled over the city, and with it came an oppressive silence that hung heavily around the Hathaway Building. The residents moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to stir the fragile peace. But Alice knew better than to believe the calm was anything but temporary. The entity, though bound once more, was far from defeated, and the journal's newly revealed writings hinted at a cycle, a recurring battle that they were now part of. Alice, Tom, and Mia met frequently, poring over the journal and the additional notes that had appeared. These new writings spoke of a guardian, a role apparently destined to oversee the containment of the entity, a role that Alice feared was hers to accept. The journal detailed the responsibilities and risks, including a warning that each blood moon would bring a stronger challenge as the entity gathered strength from forces unknown. Determined to prepare better for the next confrontation, Alice organized meetings with the residents, forming a sort of council that would oversee the safety protocols and ensure everyone was educated on the supernatural history of their building. They set up workshops on protective symbols, emergency response drills, and even invited experts in the paranormal to speak and provide training. As the community grew tighter and more proactive, the eerie incidents within the building did not cease but became more manageable. Doors would still slam shut without wind, cold spots would appear randomly, and every so often, a faint hum could be heard emanating from the sealed basement door. Each event served as a reminder of the ever-present threat lurking just below them. However, it wasn't just the physical occurrences that troubled Alice. Her dreams began to be invaded by visions of the past caretakers of the Hathaway, each sharing their own encounters and battles with the entity. These dreams, vivid and intense, seemed to be both a warning and a guide, providing Alice with a deeper understanding of the entity and the building's dark history. One night, a particularly vivid dream jolted her awake. In it, she saw the Hathaway Building as it was being constructed, the workmen unwittingly setting the foundations on an ancient burial site, disturbing the rest of spirits long forgotten. She saw the first caretaker, a stern-faced man with a heavy burden, as he sealed the entity away with the original ritual. His words echoed in her ears even as she woke, "Beware the roots of the Hathaway, for they delve deeper than stone and brick." Shaken, Alice began to investigate the physical foundations of the building. Her research led her to city archives, where she unearthed old maps that showed the building's location had once been a site of historical significance, possibly a sacred ground used by indigenous people, explaining the persistent spiritual disturbances. With each discovery, the pieces of the puzzle slowly fit together, revealing a complex tapestry of history, sacrifice, and supernatural guardianship. Alice documented everything, sharing her findings with the resident council, preparing them for the fact that their roles as temporary guardians of the Hathaway might extend beyond mere ritual and into deeper spiritual commitments. As the anniversary of her moving into Hathaway approached, Alice felt a mix of dread and determination. The next blood moon was due, and with it, another confrontation was inevitable. The building, with its new fortifications and the collective resolve of its inhabitants, felt more like a fortress than an apartment complex, but the enemy they faced was unlike any other, a force that challenged not just their safety but their sanity. On the eve of the blood moon, Alice walked through the quiet halls of Hathaway, her steps echoing softly. The building seemed to breathe around her, a slow, heavy breath of anticipation. She checked the locks on the basement door, tracing the sigils that had been freshly painted around its frame. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that tingled against her skin. As midnight approached, she joined the other residents in the lobby, forming the now familiar ritual circle. The candles were lit, their flames flickering in the still air, casting long shadows across the worried faces of her friends and neighbors. Alice opened the journal once more, its pages fluttering to the section marked for the blood moon ritual. Her voice, firm yet tinged with an underlying tremor of fear, began to recite the ancient incantations, the words weaving through the air, settling heavily around the gathered residents. Outside, the sky turned a deep, menacing shade of red, the blood moon rising ominously above the city, its light seeping through the windows and bathing everything in a sinister hue. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and a distant thunder rolled, a forewarning of the supernatural storm that was about to unfold. As the ritual progressed, the air inside the Hathaway building grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones. The candles flickered violently as if struggling against an unseen force, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The residents huddled closer, their faces marked by fear but also by a determination born of their previous encounters. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a subtle vibration at first that grew into a pronounced shake, causing the chandelier above to sway dangerously. A low hum filled the air, emanating from the direction of the basement, growing louder, more demanding. The sealed door vibrated as if something from within was trying to break free. Alice's voice wavered but regained strength, pushing through the growing cacophony. The words of the ritual seemed to resonate with the building itself, the walls pulsing rhythmically with the hum, as if the structure of Hathaway was responding to the incantations, aiding in their defense. The hum turned into a howl, a sound so harrowing it seemed to claw at the very fabric of reality. Shadows danced frenetically around the edges of the room, coalescing into vague, human-like forms at the periphery of their vision. The residents clutched each other's hands, their collective grip a lifeline against the darkness encroaching on their circle. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the howling ceased. The building shuddered, a final convulsive tremor, and then stilled. The candles flickered one last time before steadying. A profound silence enveloped the room, broken only by the collective sighs of relief from the residents. They had withstood the onslaught, the ritual had held, the entity was kept at bay, its wrath contained once more beneath the foundations of the Hathaway building. But the victory was tempered by the knowledge that this was but a temporary reprieve. The journal, now lying open on the floor where Alice had dropped it during the ritual, fluttered its pages as if caught in a non-existent breeze. It settled on a page they had not noticed before, filled with a prophecy foretelling the eventual return of the entity, stronger and more malevolent than before. The residents of Hathaway, their faces pale under the light of the blood moon, turned towards Alice, their eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and the dawning realization of their eternal role as guardians against a darkness that would return. They were bound to the building, not just by lease and law but by a duty that transcended the ordinary. Alice picked up the journal, her fingers tracing the ominous words of the prophecy. The weight of her responsibility as the guardian of Hathaway felt heavier than ever. She looked around at her fellow residents, their faces marked by fatigue, fear, but also a newfound resolve. As the blood moon cast its crimson light through the windows, bathing the lobby in its ghostly glow, the silence was a solemn reminder of the battles to come. They were custodians of a dark secret, warriors against a spectral threat that was bound to the very walls of their home. And as the night gave way to the first light of dawn, the Hathaway building stood silent on the horizon, its outline a stark silhouette against the waking sky. Inside, its residents were already preparing for the next confrontation, the next blood moon. Their lives had irrevocably changed. They were no longer just neighbors. They were comrades in arms, bound by fate to the haunted halls of Hathaway, ever vigilant, ever waiting for the darkness to rise again. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, nestled between the towering pines and shrouded in a perpetual mist, lies the small, seemingly insignificant town of Eldridge. Known only to those who dare venture off the beaten path, Eldridge harbors a dark secret, whispered about in the hushed tones of the locals and scoffed at by the few tourists who pass through. It is here, in the heart of these woods, that the legend of the Hollow Creek Beast has taken root, a cryptid story that has persisted through generations, dismissed by most as folklore until now. Emma, a budding journalist with a penchant for the paranormal, arrived in Eldridge with the intent to unearth the truth behind the myth. Armed with her camera, recording equipment, and a healthy dose of skepticism, she checked into the quaint Willows Inn, the only guest house in town, run by an elderly couple, the Harrows, who had lived in Eldridge all their lives. The walls of the inn were lined with old photographs and articles about the Hollow Creek Beast, which the locals claimed was a creature with glowing red eyes, covered in dark fur, and standing over 7 feet tall. On her first evening, while dining at the inn's only restaurant, Emma overheard hushed conversations about recent livestock mutilations and sightings of something large moving through the woods at the edge of town. Her curiosity piqued, Emma approached an old man, Jacob, one of Eldridge's lifelong residents, who seemed more than willing to share his story. Jacob told her that the creature had been a part of Eldridge's history for over a century, first mentioned in the diaries of the town's founder. According to legend, the beast guarded the entrance to Hollow Creek, an area deep in the forest where no one dared to go, rumored to be cursed. Jacob warned her, people who go looking for the beast aren't likely to come back the same, if they come back at all. Undeterred, Emma decided to venture into Hollow Creek the next day. She prepared her backpack with essentials and her recording equipment. As she set out at dawn, the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees towering like silent sentinels. The deeper she went, the quieter the woods became, as if even the birds and insects knew to stay away from Hollow Creek. Hours passed as Emma followed the old, overgrown trail Jacob had described. Finally, she reached the creek, its water dark and eerily still. Setting up her equipment, she began to document her surroundings, speaking into her recorder about the lack of wildlife and the oppressive silence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Emma heard a rustling in the bushes behind her. Whipping around, her camera at the ready, she caught a fleeting glimpse of something large moving just at the edge of her vision. Heart racing, she reviewed the camera footage, but it was too blurry, the creature too quick. That night, Emma camped by the creek, her fire the only light in the consuming darkness of the woods. The crackling of the flames seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. As she sat there, the rustling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Emma grabbed her camera, pointing it towards the sound, her hands shaking. Through the viewfinder, she saw 2 glowing red eyes staring back at her. She gasped, the camera falling from her numb fingers as the creature stepped into the light of the fire. It was massive, its fur matted and dark, its eyes burning with an intelligent, malevolent light. Emma reached slowly for her fallen camera, keeping her eyes on the creature. It watched her, unmoving and silent, then, as if deciding she was no threat, it turned and vanished into the darkness with a grace that belied its size. Shaken, Emma spent a sleepless night by the dying fire, every sound in the forest magnifying her fear. At first light, she hurried back to Eldridge, her equipment heavy on her back and the weight of what she had seen even heavier on her mind. Back at the inn, Emma reviewed her footage, the creature's eyes glowing ominously from the screen. She knew she had to go back, to learn more about the beast, to understand why it watched Hollow Creek and what it protected. Determined, she planned a longer expedition, enlisting the help of Jacob, who, despite his reservations, agreed to guide her deeper into the forest. They prepared for a journey that would take them further into the unknown, into the heart of the cryptid's territory. As they set out the following morning, the forest seemed even more foreboding than before. The path was less clear, the trees denser, and the silence deeper. They made their way slowly towards Hollow Creek, the air growing colder with each step, the sense of being watched intensifying. Hours into their journey, the trail vanished altogether, leaving them to rely solely on Jacob's knowledge of the land. The old man moved with surprising agility, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as if he expected the woods to shift and change at any moment. Emma followed closely, her camera recording everything, her senses heightened to every little sound and movement around them. As they delved deeper into the woods, the trees grew so close together that their branches intertwined, casting the forest floor into perpetual twilight. Moss and vines hung from every surface, adding to the sense of entering another world, untouched and ruled by ancient forces. Suddenly, Jacob stopped, his hand raised for silence. Emma froze, listening. A low, mournful howl echoed through the trees, a sound so filled with loneliness and despair it made Emma's heart ache. It was answered by another on the opposite side of the trail, this one higher, more urgent. Jacob turned to Emma, his face grave. "They're communicating," he whispered. "It's rare to hear them call out to each other like this. We must be near the heart of their territory." They continued with even greater caution, now aware that more than one creature could be lurking nearby. The forest seemed to respond to their presence, the atmosphere growing thicker, the shadows darker. Emma's camera picked up little in the dim light, but she kept it rolling, capturing the sounds of the unseen creatures calling to one another. As they approached a clearing, the ground became soggy underfoot, the air damp and cold. Jacob pointed towards a large, overgrown mound in the middle of the clearing. "That's an ancient burial site," he said, his voice barely audible. "Some say it's where the creatures come from, that they're the guardians of these sacred grounds." Emma filmed the mound, her camera's night vision casting everything in a greenish hue. She felt a chill run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that they were standing in a place of significant power and mystery. The howling had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that hung over the clearing like a shroud. Then, rustling from the edge of the clearing shattered the silence, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the beast, its fur matted and eyes glowing. But it was not alone. Beside it walked another creature, smaller, with lighter fur but the same piercing red eyes. Jacob and Emma remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the creature stopped at the edge of the burial mound and looked directly at them. There was a palpable intelligence in their gaze, an assessment, a weighing of their presence there. Emma, overcoming her initial shock, slowly raised her camera, filming the creatures as they watched her. After what seemed like an eternity, the larger beast gave a short, sharp bark, a sound that had no echo in the thick air of the clearing. In response, the creatures turned and silently vanished back into the forest, leaving Emma and Jacob alone with the ancient secrets of the mound. They retreated from the clearing, the sense of being watched never leaving them. As they made their way back to Eldridge, the forest around them seemed to whisper, the trees swaying gently as if in farewell, or perhaps in warning. Back at the inn, Emma reviewed the footage, her hands shaking not just from the cold but from the raw emotion of the encounter. She knew she had captured something extraordinary, something that could change not only her career but her understanding of the world. As she sat in the dim light of her room, watching the glowing eyes of the cryptids on her screen, she knew she needed to go back. There were answers in that forest, secrets that the creatures guarded, intertwined with the history and the spirit of the land itself. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma planned her next expedition. She would go deeper into the woods, armed with better equipment, more knowledge, and a resolve to uncover the mysteries of Hollow Creek. The creatures had shown themselves to her, a sign that perhaps they, too, wanted their story told. As the night deepened, the wind outside the inn picked up, howling like the creatures in the forest. Emma lay in bed, restless, her mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The cryptids of Hollow Creek had opened a door to a world she had never imagined, and she was ready to step through it, whatever the cost. The next morning, under a gray, foreboding sky, Emma prepared for her return to the heart of Hollow Creek. She packed her equipment meticulously, including multiple cameras, audio recorders, and even an infrared thermal camera provided by an intrigued paranormal researcher from a neighboring town. Her goal was not just to observe, but to interact, to understand. Jacob, though apprehensive, agreed once more to guide her, driven by his own deep-seated need to understand the forces that had overshadowed his home for so long. Their journey back into the forest was tense, the air thick with the memory of the previous day's encounter. The path, barely visible under the overgrowth, seemed to close in around them as they walked, the trees whispering secrets in a language felt rather than heard. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves underfoot heightened the atmosphere of suspense. As they neared the clearing, the forest grew ominously silent, the usual sounds of wildlife abruptly muted as if every creature was holding its breath. Emma's hand hovered over her camera, her finger ready to press record at the slightest provocation. The clearing appeared suddenly before them, the burial mound looming ominously at its center. The air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, a visual distortion that made Emma's eyes water when she tried to focus on it. Setting up her equipment around the perimeter of the clearing, she made sure to capture every angle, not wanting to miss anything this time. Jacob stood watch while Emma initiated the recording devices. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the clearing that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as if the very air was charged with electricity, anticipation building in the space between each gust. Without warning, the thermal camera began to pick up a sudden heat signature near the mound, a form gradually taking shape in the viewfinder as a substantial, heat-emitting entity. It was much larger than the creatures they had encountered before, its form indistinct but unmistakably massive. Emma and Jacob watched, frozen, as the figure seemed to notice their presence. The temperature around them dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the air as they stared at the figure. It stood motionless, as if assessing them, its heat signature the only proof that it was there, watching. The courage that had fueled Emma's return to the clearing wavered, a primal fear taking hold as she realized they might have intruded too far into the domain of the cryptids. But before she could decide on a course of action, another figure appeared beside the first, smaller, its movements more tentative. It was one of the creatures they had seen the previous night, its familiar red eyes visible even through the thermal camera. Emma reached slowly for her regular camera, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. As she filmed, the smaller creature stepped forward, its body language curious rather than aggressive. It tilted its head, watching her as intently as she watched it. A low, guttural sound emanated from its throat, a sound that, to Emma's astonishment, seemed more inquisitive than threatening. The larger figure remained still, its intentions unclear. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she continued to record, her mind racing with questions. What were these creatures? Protectors of this ancient land, or something else entirely? Jacob, sensing the tension, began to speak softly in a language Emma did not recognize. He later explained it was an old tribal dialect taught to him by his grandmother, used in times of peace offerings and to show respect to the spirits of the land. The smaller creature cocked its head, listening, its stance relaxing slightly. This moment of tense communication was abruptly shattered by a loud crack from the opposite side of the clearing. All heads turned as another figure emerged from the trees, this one unmistakably human. A local hunter, rifle in hand, stood at the edge of the clearing, his presence an immediate threat to the fragile connection being forged. The creatures recoiled, the larger one stepping protectively in front of the smaller. Emma felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for these mysterious beings they had only just begun to understand. She stepped forward, raising her hands in a universal gesture of peace, her camera still recording. "Don't shoot," she yelled to the hunter, her voice echoing through the clearing. The hunter paused, confusion and fear evident on his face. As Emma tried to defuse the situation, explaining their purpose here to the hunter, the larger creature watched warily. The air was thick with tension, every movement scrutinized, every breath held. The standoff in the clearing, with its mix of human and cryptid actors, was a precarious moment, a snapshot of conflict and coexistence on a knife edge. The creatures, sensing the potential for violence, began to retreat slowly, melting back into the forest from whence they came. Emma's heart sank as she watched them go, her chance to understand more slipping away with them. She turned back to the hunter, her eyes fierce, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You could have ruined everything." "We're not here to harm them," she asserted, the gravity of the moment drawing a line between her intentions and the hunter's instincts. The hunter, lowering his rifle slightly, appeared conflicted. "I've been tracking that big one for weeks," he confessed, his voice a mix of defensiveness and curiosity. "Didn't realize you folks were out here trying to make friends with them." Jacob, maintaining a watchful eye on the spot where the creatures had disappeared, spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "These beings, they're not just animals. They're part of this land's history, maybe even its guardians. We must respect that, try to understand, not eliminate." The tension slowly abated as the hunter listened, his demeanor softening under the weight of their words. Emma, seizing the moment, suggested, "Why don't you join us? See what we're trying to do here. Maybe there's more to these woods than just game." Reluctantly, the hunter nodded, agreeing to observe, to learn rather than to hunt. This uneasy alliance formed out of necessity marked a new chapter in the unfolding story of Hollow Creek. As they all turned their gaze back to the forest, the shadows seemed to watch them, the secrets of the woods whispering just beyond their reach. With nightfall approaching, they decided to set up camp near the clearing, the hunter's presence a guarantee against further surprise visits. As darkness enveloped the forest, the sounds of the nocturnal creatures filled the air, a reminder that they were visitors in a world not their own. Throughout the night, Emma's cameras and recording equipment were active, capturing every sound, every movement. Several times, she thought she saw the glint of eyes watching from the darkness, the cryptids observing the strange gathering in their territory. In the deep hours of the night, a startling discovery was made. The thermal camera, left on a tripod pointing toward the mound, picked up unusual heat patterns moving in a deliberate, circular pattern around the clearing. Jacob, awake and monitoring the screens, called everyone to observe. The display showed heat signatures that resembled no known animal, their movements synchronized and purposeful. "It's a ritual," Jacob whispered, his voice full of awe. "They're still here, performing their ancient rites." The group watched, captivated by the glowing figures on the screen. The ritual lasted until the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, the heat signatures fading as the morning cold took hold. As the sun rose, casting light on the faces of the humans who had spent the night in the heart of a mystery, Emma felt a profound connection to Hollow Creek. The previous night's recordings were proof of something extraordinary, something that demanded more than just passing curiosity. Determined to delve deeper, Emma proposed a plan to establish a more permanent observation post in the clearing. With the hunters' begrudging assistance, they could ensure safety and continuous observation. "We need to document everything, establish a timeline, patterns, understand their behaviors and rituals," Emma explained, her journalistic instincts melding with a newfound protector's resolve. Jacob, ever the guardian of his homeland's secrets, nodded in agreement. We're on the edge of something profound. This isn't just about a story anymore. It's about coexistence, respect, and maybe even protection for these creatures. The hunter, whose name they learned was Dan, was still wrestling with his role in this new reality. Never thought I'd be part of something like this, he admitted, looking out into the now quiet woods. Hunting's been my life, but this, he paused, searching for the words, this is different. As they packed up their camp, Emma reviewed the footage from the night, each frame revealing more layers to the mystery of Hollow Creek. The images of the ritual, the synchronized movement of the cryptids, provided more questions than answers. What were they protecting? Why perform these rituals? And most importantly, what role did humans play in the ancient history of these woods? As they prepared to leave the clearing, Emma felt a chill that wasn't from the morning air. She turned to catch a final glimpse of the mound, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing there, watching them leave. The figure was shrouded in the morning mist, its outline too indistinct to identify, but its presence was felt, a silent sentinel, a reminder that they were merely guests in this ancient place. With a deep breath, Emma turned back to her companions, ready to face the challenges ahead. They were stepping into uncharted territory, both literally and metaphorically. The road back to Eldridge was quiet, each person lost in their thoughts, pondering the implications of their night in Hollow Creek. The mystery had deepened, the stakes were higher, and their journey was far from over. They were now not just explorers or witnesses, but active participants in a story that was unfolding with each step deeper into the unknown. Upon their return to Eldridge, the trio, now a team bound by their extraordinary experiences, began to organize a more structured investigation. Emma reached out to experts in cryptozoology, anthropology, and even folklore, aiming to gather a diverse team that could approach the mystery of Hollow Creek from multiple angles. Meanwhile, Jacob worked on securing permissions and support from local authorities and the indigenous communities whose ancestral lands they were exploring. Dan, the hunter, took on the responsibility of setting up the observation post. His transformation from hunter to protector was a poignant symbol of the change taking place within all of them. He meticulously mapped out the area, setting up cameras and sensors that would alert them to any movement, whether from cryptids or human intruders. As the days passed and their preparations took shape, the atmosphere in Eldridge grew tense. The town, once merely a backdrop for their explorations, seemed to throb with an energy of its own. The locals, initially skeptical and distant, began to take an interest in their project. Some shared their own encounters and stories, adding layers of depth to the legend of Hollow Creek. Others warned them to tread carefully, hinting at dangers not just from the cryptids but from the land itself, which they said had a way of protecting its secrets. One chilly evening, as Emma reviewed the footage from their installed cameras, she noticed an anomaly. The cameras near the mound had gone offline, one by one, not due to technical failures but as if something had deliberately disabled them. The last image captured before the blackout was a chilling frame of multiple red eyes peering out from the darkness, not aggressive, but undeniably watchful. The team gathered to discuss this new development. The mood was somber, the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly complex and dangerous. They decided to make a nighttime visit to the site to investigate and repair the cameras. Armed with their equipment and a newfound sense of urgency, they drove through the winding forest roads under a crescent moon. The woods were eerily silent, the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures strangely muted. As they approached the site, the headlights of their vehicle caught glimpses of shadows flitting between the trees, too quick to identify but palpably real. When they reached the clearing, the air was thick with mist, swirling around them like wraiths. They moved cautiously, their lights piercing the fog only to reveal more thick, impenetrable mist. As they neared the mound, the temperature dropped, breaths turning to visible puffs in the cold air. Emma, leading the way, felt a deep, primal fear knotting her stomach. The silence was oppressive, the weight of unseen eyes upon them almost tangible. They reached the first camera to find it torn from its mount, the wires severed cleanly, not by teeth but by something sharp. Before they could react, a low, resonant growl rolled through the clearing, not from one direction but all around them, surrounding them. The mist seemed to pulse with it, tightening around them like a noose. Panic surged as they realized they were not alone, and whatever was with them was hurting them closer together, closer to the mound. Suddenly, from the mist, figures emerged, not just one or two, but a whole pack of the creatures, their eyes glowing, their intentions unreadable. The team backed towards the mound, the only clear space, as the creatures circled. Emma's camera rolled, capturing this surreal standoff, her reporter's instinct overtaking her fear. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the creatures stopped, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed not on the humans but on something behind them. Slowly, the team turned to see what had caught the cryptid's attention. There, rising from the mound, was a larger, more imposing figure, its presence commanding, its eyes a deep, piercing red that spoke of ancient knowledge and power. The air vibrated with its energy, a silent command emanating from it, directing its kin. The team found themselves caught between the cryptids and this new, formidable entity, the true guardian of Hollow Creek. The standoff was palpable, each second stretching endlessly as decisions hung in the balance. The creature's gaze met Emma's, a connection that felt both threatening and profound, a silent communication that they were intruding on sacred ground, treading paths not meant for them. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a silvery glow over the clearing, the creature raised its head, letting out a powerful, mournful howl that resonated through the woods, shaking the leaves on the trees. It was a signal, a call to something deeper in the forest, something even more ancient and hidden. The team, realizing the gravity of their situation, slowly retreated, the cryptids parting to let them pass, their eyes never leaving the humans. As they made their way back to their vehicle, the weight of the creature's gaze bore down on them, a reminder that they had ventured into a realm where humanity was not in control, where ancient pacts and guardians ruled. Back in their vehicle, the team sat in silence, the engine idling as they processed what had happened. The drive back to Eldridge was quiet, each lost in their thoughts, the implications of their encounter hanging heavy in the air. Emma knew that their story was far from over. They had touched on something profound, a truth guarded by beings not willing to relinquish their secrets easily. The connection she had felt, the understanding that had passed between her and the Guardian, haunted her. She knew she would return, that she must return to learn, to understand. As Eldridge faded into the distance behind them, the first light of dawn tinged the sky with pink and gold. The night's events felt like a dream, surreal and distant yet undeniably real. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and discovery, a path that would inevitably lead them back to the heart of Hollow Creek, back to the mysteries that lay hidden in its shadows. In the sprawling suburb of Oakwood, the local Walmart wasn't just a shopping destination, it was a beacon in the community, a place where locals met, shopped, and worked. However, beneath the surface of daily bargains and friendly chatter, dark rumors circulated. Employees whispered of unexplained occurrences after hours, of aisles that rearranged themselves, and of a chilling presence that seemed to stalk the store's vast, linoleum-floored expanse during the graveyard shift. Sarah, a recent college graduate, took a job at this Walmart as a night manager to save up for grad school. It was her responsibility to oversee the stocking team and ensure the store was ready for the bustling business of the following day. On her first night, she noticed how the atmosphere of the store shifted once the sun set. The bright fluorescent lights that filled the store with harsh, white light also cast deep, menacing shadows in the less frequented corners of the vast building. The friendly chatter of daytime was replaced by a deep, unnerving silence, broken only by the occasional crash of a box being dropped or the distant hum of the refrigerators. One of Sarah's duties was to perform a final walkthrough of the store at the end of each shift. This task, typically routine, became a source of dread. She started noticing that items from the toy section seemed to move inexplicably. A doll placed firmly on a high shelf at closing would be found in the middle of an aisle in the morning. Initially, she rationalized it as the work of forgetful employees or perhaps her own tired mind playing tricks on her. As the weeks passed, the disturbances grew more frequent and more intense. The toy section was often in complete disarray, with boxes opened and contents scattered. One night, as Sarah reviewed security footage to catch the culprit, she froze in horror. The video revealed the silhouette of a small child, skipping down the toy aisle at exactly 3:07 a.m., stopping to pick up toys, and then disappearing from the frame as abruptly as it had appeared. The timestamp indicated that this had occurred just minutes after Sarah had last walked through that aisle. There was no other entry or exit caught on camera. Shaken, Sarah decided to confide in her colleague, Tom, a longtime security guard who had worked at the store for over a decade. Tom listened intently, his face growing pale as Sarah described what she had seen. After a moment of silence, he leaned in close and whispered that Sarah wasn't the first to notice strange happenings in the store. He recounted stories from other employees, some of whom had left the job because of their experiences. Toys were not the only anomalies. There were also reports of ghostly whispers in the clothing section, cold breezes sweeping through the locked and sealed grocery area, and shadows flitting through the back warehouse, where no living person was supposed to be. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah and Tom decided to conduct their own investigation after the store closed one night. They equipped themselves with flashlights and a digital recorder to capture any auditory phenomena. Starting at midnight, they patrolled the aisles, focusing on the spots where the most activity had been reported. Their first stop was the toy aisle. As they approached, the temperature dropped noticeably, their breath visible in the air despite the indoor setting. Sarah felt a tug at her jacket, but when she turned, there was nothing but the empty aisle behind her. Tom, who was a few steps ahead, swore he heard laughter, a child's laughter, light and mocking. It seemed to come from all directions, bouncing off the shelves in a disorienting echo. Next, they moved to the clothing section. Here, the hangers clattered as if caught in a gust of wind, though there was no air circulation that could explain it. Tom raised the digital recorder, asking aloud if anyone was there with them. The only answer was the sudden, intense static that erupted from the recorder, causing both to wince at the harsh sound. Hours passed as they continued their exploration, each section of the store revealing new horrors. In the grocery area, despite the locked coolers, they found a trail of wet footprints, as if someone had walked through the aisles dripping with water. These inexplicable phenomena culminated in the back warehouse, where the shadows seemed thickest. Here, they felt a palpable sense of dread, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. As they turned the corner past rows of high shelves stocked with overstock, both flashlights flickered and went out simultaneously, plunging them into darkness. A low whisper filled the space, the words indistinct but unmistakably human. Sarah reached out to find Tom's hand, but instead, her fingers brushed against something cold, something that felt like another hand, small and delicate, like that of a child. Her breath caught in her throat as the faint light from the emergency exit signs illuminated the warehouse just enough to reveal the outline of a small figure, standing just a few feet away, staring at them. The figure was indistinct, its edges blurred as if made of mist, but its eyes, unnervingly clear, locked onto Sarah with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Tom, grasping for his flashlight, finally managed to click it back on, but the light pierced through the figure, illuminating only the racks behind it. The childlike apparition had vanished. Heart-pounding, Sarah suggested they review the digital recorder to see if they had captured any voices. Rewinding to the moment of their encounter, they played back the audio. Amid the static, a faint voice could be heard, its tone melancholic and eerie. "Find me," it said, followed by a soft sobbing that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Determined to get to the bottom of these occurrences, Sarah and Tom decided to dig deeper into the history of the land on which the Walmart was built. Their research at the local library turned up disturbing revelations. The site had once been home to an old orphanage that burned down under mysterious circumstances in the late 1800s. Many children perished in the fire, their remains never recovered. The orphanage was eventually forgotten, and over the decades, the tragedy that occurred there faded from public memory. The more they learned, the more the pieces began to fit together. The sightings, the sounds, and the childlike apparitions seemed to be linked to the tragic past of the orphanage. Sarah theorized that the spirit of one of the orphaned children might be reaching out, trapped in a liminal space between worlds, perhaps unable to move on due to the trauma of the past. With this new understanding, Sarah and Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. They believed that if they could somehow help the child spirit find peace, the disturbances might cease. They decided to conduct a more formal investigation and possibly a ritual to help the spirit move on. They reached out to a local paranormal investigation team known for their sensitive and ethical approach to dealing with haunted locations. The team arrived equipped with more advanced equipment, including EMF meters, thermal cameras, and a medium who specialized in communicating with spirits. As night fell, the team set up their equipment in the key areas where Sarah and Tom had experienced the most activity. The medium, Ms. Avery, began to walk through the aisles, her hands outstretched, her face concentrated as she tried to sense the presence of the spirit. As they approached the toy section, Ms. Avery suddenly stopped, her body rigid. "There's a lot of sadness here," she whispered. "This child, he's so lost, so confused." Her voice trembled as she spoke, conveying the depth of the child's despair. The EMF meter spiked, and the thermal camera showed a sudden drop in temperature around her. Ms. Avery sat down in the middle of the aisle, the team forming a protective circle around her. She began to speak gently into the air, addressing the unseen child with words of comfort and reassurance. "We know you're here, and we know you're scared. We want to help you find your way home." The store fell eerily silent, the usual creaks and groans of the building seeming to pause as if in anticipation. Then, the toys began to move on their own. Balls rolled slowly out from their shelves, a toy car drove in a tight circle, and a stuffed bear raised its arm. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, as if the child were playing a silent game with them. Ms. Avery continued to speak softly, urging the spirit to let go of the world of the living and to move towards the light that would take him to peace. The atmosphere began to change, the air growing warmer, the oppressive sense of sadness lifting slightly. Just as it seemed the ritual was reaching a climax, a sudden loud crash echoed through the store from the direction of the back warehouse. The team jumped, their attention snapping towards the sound. The cameras and lights were immediately directed to the source of the disturbance. As they hurried towards the warehouse, Sarah felt a tugging sensation at her heart, a mix of fear and hope battling within her. They reached the warehouse to find a section of shelving had collapsed, cans and boxes strewn across the floor. But among the chaos, there was something else, a faint glow emanating from beneath the rubble. As they cleared the debris, they uncovered an old, charred sign that had been hidden beneath the shelving units. The paint was mostly peeled off, but the words Oakwood Orphanage were still legible on the scorched wood. The revelation hit them all with the weight of history, the tragic past of the site making its presence felt even in the modern edifice of the Walmart. As they stood there, contemplating the sign, a soft giggle echoed through the warehouse, chilling and yet somehow no longer menacing. It seemed the spirit was acknowledging their discovery, a sign of recognition from the unseen presence that had so deeply affected their lives. As the echo of the giggle faded into the vast, shadowy reaches of the warehouse, Ms. Avery spoke up, her voice cutting through the tense air. "He's been waiting so long for someone to acknowledge his pain, to remember them, to remember this place." The team, surrounded by the remnants of the past, felt a collective chill run through them as the weight of her words settled in. It was not just one child's spirit that haunted the aisles of Walmart, but possibly the lost souls of many children, each clinging to the remnants of a forgotten tragedy. Determined to bring peace to these restless spirits, Sarah suggested they hold a vigil to honor the memory of the children who perished in the orphanage fire. The local community was invited, and the vigil was set up in the parking lot of the Walmart, with candles, photographs of the old orphanage that they could find, and an array of flowers and toys. The night of the vigil was eerily calm, with a gentle breeze whispering through the assembled crowd as people from all over Oakwood gathered, drawn by the story of the forgotten tragedy and the recent strange occurrences. As candles were lit and the medium began to recite a prayer for the lost souls, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the air. Partway through the vigil, a soft, almost imperceptible humming began to resonate around the crowd. The candles flickered as if in response to the humming, and a light mist began to form, swirling around the photographs and candles. The temperature dropped sharply, and the attendees huddled closer, their breath visible in the chilling air. Miss Avery, her voice steady but filled with emotion, called out to the spirits of the children, inviting them to join the vigil and accept the community's acknowledgement and remembrance. "We gather here to offer you peace," she intoned, "to remember your lives and provide the solace you have been denied for so long." As she spoke, the toys that had been placed among the flowers began to move. A small, stuffed dog wagged its tail, a tiny plastic soldier raised its arm in salute, and a ragged doll blinked its glassy eyes. The crowd gasped, some in fear, others in wonder, as the supernatural phenomena unfolded before them. But then, the ground beneath them began to tremble subtly, as if the earth itself was responding to the deep, unresolved sorrow of the past. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and the mist thickened, enveloping everyone in a soft, cold blanket. The medium raised her arms, her voice rising over the hum, "Spirits of the orphanage, hear our plea. Move beyond this world, find peace in the light." Suddenly, the air snapped with electricity, and a bright orb of light appeared above the vigil, casting a gentle, serene glow over the crowd. Faces turned upwards, eyes wide in awe as the orb pulsed with a warm, inviting light. The humming ceased, and the mist began to dissipate, revealing the first clear night sky seen in weeks. The vigil continued into the early hours of the morning, the community united in a shared purpose. As dawn approached, the orb slowly faded, and a sense of peace settled over the parking lot. The attendees began to disperse, speaking in hushed tones about the night's incredible events, the healing they felt, and the hope that the spirits had found their way to peace. However, as the Walmart employees, including Sarah and Tom, returned to the store to resume their duties, an unspoken question hung in the air. Had they truly resolved the haunting? The store seemed quieter, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the history of the land on which it stood was long and complicated. Weeks passed without incident, and life at the Walmart returned to some semblance of normalcy. Yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. The vigil had been powerful, a significant step toward healing, but was it enough to appease decades, perhaps centuries, of unrest? Her question was answered one night as she closed up the store. As she walked through the toy aisle, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. Turning, she expected to see nothing, hoping her mind was playing tricks on her. But there, at the end of the aisle, the ghostly image of a small child stood watching her, its expression one of solemnity and perhaps a lingering need. The child's apparition slowly faded, leaving Sarah in the silent, empty aisle. The message was clear: there was more to be done, more secrets to uncover, more healing required. As she stood there, a resolve settled over her. The story of the Oakwood Walmart, built on the ashes of the old orphanage, was far from over. The journey to uncover the full truth of the land, to bring final peace to all restless spirits entangled with its history, was just beginning. The next day, Sarah started delving deeper into the archives, pulling up old land deeds, newspaper clippings from the time of the orphanage, and any historical records that mentioned the area. Each document seemed to add another layer to the complex tapestry of Oakwood's hidden past. Among the brittle pages and faded texts, she discovered references to older structures and even some local legends that hinted at ancient curses and long-forgotten graveyards that might have been disturbed during the building's construction. Fueled by a mix of dread and determination, Sarah arranged meetings with local historians and paranormal experts. Each conversation opened new avenues of inquiry. It became clear that to truly understand the haunting, she would have to explore not just the orphanage's history but also deeper into the pre-colonial history of the land itself. One chilly evening, as Sarah was organizing her notes, Tom approached her with a concerned look. He had been doing some research of his own, talking to the older residents of Oakwood, some of whom had lived there their whole lives. From them, he learned about an old legend, seldom spoken of, about a watcher of the woods, a spirit guardian that was said to protect sacred grounds. According to local lore, if these grounds were ever desecrated, the watcher would awaken to reclaim them. Tom's revelation gave Sarah pause. The implications were chilling. The Walmart might not only be haunted by the spirits of the children from the orphanage but also by something older, more powerful. They needed to find out where these sacred grounds were exactly located and if the Walmart had indeed been built over them. Their investigation took on a new urgency. Sarah and Tom spent nights poring over old maps and records, trying to pinpoint the exact locations mentioned in the legends. They interviewed tribal elders from the local indigenous community, who spoke of a time when their ancestors would perform rituals to appease the Watcher and keep the peace in the land. Armed with this new information, Sarah proposed an audacious plan. They would perform a ritual, one that combined the old ways of the indigenous people with the remembrance they had already conducted for the orphanage children. She hoped that by honoring all the spirits tied to the land, they might finally bring peace to the area and end the hauntings. With the help of the indigenous elders and the local community, they prepared for the ritual. It was to be held on the next full moon, a time believed to be powerful for such ceremonies. The preparation involved collecting sacred objects, learning the correct chants, and, most importantly, making peace offerings to the Watcher. As the full moon approached, the atmosphere around the Walmart grew tenser. Employees reported seeing shadows moving just at the edge of their vision, hearing whispers in empty aisles, and feeling sudden drops in temperature. The activity seemed to intensify as if the spirits were aware of the upcoming ritual and were reacting to it. On the night of the ritual, the community gathered in the parking lot, much like they had for the vigil. But this time, the area was arranged in a circle with the sacred objects at the center. The elders led the ceremony, guiding Sarah, Tom, and the others through each step. As they chanted, the wind picked up, swirling around them, lifting leaves and debris in a dance around the circle. Halfway through the ritual, a profound silence fell over the crowd. It was as if the very air was waiting, holding its breath. Then, a low rumble started beneath their feet, growing louder, more insistent. The ground vibrated, and several people stumbled, trying to keep their balance. Sarah, standing at the center of the circle, felt a sudden warmth envelop her, a stark contrast to the cold wind. She looked up to see a figure materializing in front of her. It was taller, more imposing than the childlike apparitions they had seen before. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the moonlight, held a wisdom and a sadness that was palpable. The figure, which she believed to be the Watcher, raised its arms, and the wind ceased abruptly, the silence deepening. It spoke then, not with words but directly into their minds, a voice ancient and resonant that filled Sarah with an overwhelming sense of awe and fear. "You have disturbed the sacred, but you seek to mend," the voice said, its tone neither accusing nor forgiving. "The balance must be restored, the land must be healed." As it spoke, the figure's form began to fade, dissolving into the night air, leaving behind a palpable sense of expectation. The ritual continued, with the community now more united in their purpose, their chants more fervent. As the ceremony concluded, the air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the Walmart seemed to lift. The participants felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, their faces lit by the soft glow of the remaining candles as they quietly contemplated the significance of what had just occurred. The ground beneath them felt stable again, no longer vibrating with the restless energy of the disturbed. The night air, which had earlier carried a charge of tension and anticipation, now seemed to breathe a gentle, cleansing sigh over the land. Sarah and Tom stood side by side, their eyes scanning the dark horizon that bordered the Walmart parking lot. They shared a look of cautious hope, wondering if their efforts had truly calmed the spirits or merely appeased them temporarily. The weight of their responsibility lingered heavily in the silence between them. As the last of the community members began to disperse, heading towards the dimly lit safety of their cars, a cold breeze swept across the parking lot, rustling through the leaves and whispering secrets only the night could understand. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The breeze seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. "Thank you, but remember." The words trailed off, leaving an echo in Sarah's mind. She turned to Tom, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and intrigue. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom, looking equally unsettled, nodded slowly. "I heard it. It sounded like a warning, or maybe a promise." They looked back at the now empty ritual site, the candles extinguished, the sacred objects packed away, leaving no trace of the ceremony except for the flattened grass and a lingering sense of the supernatural. The Walmart stood in the background, its massive structure casting a long shadow over the land, as if standing watch over the secrets it housed. As they prepared to leave, a sudden movement at the edge of the parking lot caught Sarah's attention. She squinted into the darkness, her heart pounding with a familiar dread. There, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, she could see a small figure standing alone. It was the childlike apparition, the one that had first drawn her into the depths of the Walmart's haunted past. The figure stood still, its outline blurry and indistinct. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, a silent, solemn gesture that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The message was clear: while they might have achieved some peace tonight, the story was far from over. The spirits were still watching, still waiting, and still tied to the land on which the Walmart stood. Sarah felt a resolve firming within her, the night's events only deepening her commitment to uncovering all the layers of the haunted ground. She knew this brief peace might be just a prelude to more discoveries, more challenges. She glanced at Tom, who seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts. "We'll keep watching," he said quietly, his voice firm with determination. "And we'll be ready." As they walked back to the store, the first light of dawn began to touch the sky, casting a